Welcome everyone to the Nonprofit Times webinar on being a trailblazer or a laggard in the data-centric universe that is evolving quickly. Today's session is going to look at the hyper-focusing on the donor experience that is both a common and critical theme for driving successful fundraising strategies. The novel theory of our panelists today is that the new reality is that every nonprofit is now a data company, and the collection of data is everyone's job, both for marketing and the fundraising sides of the organization. But the management, augmentation, and segmentation of data is what differentiates the laggards, the trailblazers. Our distinguished panelists will examine emerging trends, best practices that equip you to leverage data strategically, serve today's donor demands, and remain relevant in the ever-evolving landscape. We're fortunate to have three top experts share their experiences. Dawn Galasso, Vice President of Sales for GivingDNA, Richard Geiger, Senior Vice President of Nonprofit Solutions at Data Axle, and Harmonie Farrow, Director of Annual Giving at Children's Medical Center Foundation. These panelists bring decades of experience helping thousands of nonprofits traverse the ever-emerging meta for nonprofit organizations. To begin our session today, Dawn.
Thank you so much, John. Excuse me, I have a frog in my throat. So welcome everybody. We're super excited for you to join today's session. Just to give you a bit of background on myself and my fellow speakers, and I'm gonna let them do a little small intro to you also. My name is Dawn Galasso, and I'm the Vice President of Sales for Pursuant and GivingDNA. I've been in data in the nonprofit space for over a decade. And so this is really a topic that speaks my language very well. And Harmonie, would you do a quick intro on you as well?
Sure, absolutely. Harmonie Farrow. I have served as the Director of Annual Giving for the Children's Medical Center Foundation in Dallas, Texas for the last 2 years. Prior to that, I worked in annual giving and donor relations in higher education for 13 years. So this is an area that is near and dear to my heart as well. Very thankful to be able to join Dawn and Richard today.
Thank you, Harmonie. And then Richard, would you mind doing an intro on you?
Sure, Richard Geiger. I am an urban and regional planner by trade, so I love data, I love regression analysis, and I love to tell stories about it. I've been working in the fundraising technology business process, quantitative and qualitative space for about 25 years, and I like using data to deliver more mission. So I'm excited to sort of talk about that today.
That's great. Thank you, Richard. So let's kind of set the format for what we're going to be discussing today. And we wanted to break it down into 4 key points that we wanted to talk about and then really drill into each of them. The first is, what does data-driven really mean? And why it shouldn't be intimidating to you to really strive for a data-driven strategy in the nonprofit, in your nonprofits. The second is, why is timing critical for this right now? There's a lot of upcoming data privacy laws, as well as other things that are making data and the way we have historically collected it could be changing in the future. So timing can be really essential to making decisions on data right now. And then augmented intelligence. What is the data universe? What does it mean? Like, what's the difference between first-party data and second-party data and third-party data? What data should I be collecting even? Is there data that I should ignore? And then the last thing is, what is multi-channel versus omni-channel? Do we need to focus on it? What's the data that we should gather when we are looking at that? And why should we even be looking at it? So I'm going to start with talking a little bit about the donor experience and why data matters now more than ever. And when you think about it, all of our donors and every other aspect of their lives are engaging with companies that do an amazing job, the ones that are extremely successful, of getting data, collecting data on the individuals that do business with them, and then providing an incredible experience to them that feels very personalized. So when you think about Amazon, when you log into Amazon, your experience probably looks very different than mine. 20 years ago, we would all log into Amazon. It was that kind of blue-gray screen, and it had books with bullet points next to it. It was a one-to-many type of a communication strategy or outreach strategy. Now, they've been brilliant about making that a very personalized strategy. The reason why they can do this is because they collect a bunch of data. They don't have somebody behind the scenes saying, hey, Dawn just logged into Amazon, so let's talk to her about the things she wants. They use data to drive everything that they do, so they can do this at scale, at huge scales. Netflix does it really well when it comes to the different movies we like to watch. I was at Marriott recently, and it's when I went into my room, I actually can set ahead of time what I like the room temperature to be at. Do I want feather pillows or foam pillows in the room? Do I need an allergy sensitive room? These are things that our donors in every other aspect of their lives are experiencing. And then we as nonprofits have found it very, very difficult up to that point to be able to gather the right kind of data and use that data in a way that helps personalize the experience. So Richard, I love this slide because to me, it all comes down to the human experience. So gathering all of this different data drives our donor to have a more human experience with it. And I know you love data as well. Can you give me a little bit of how you feel about that as well?
Yeah, so it's really interesting in the spaces, right? You know, I was brought up in a major gift kind of bubble, and what we always do in major gifts is it was a one-to-one experience. And when I sort of went through the pyramid and I started working with annual fund and direct mail and mass marketing, what I really tried to do was understand how do I create that major gift experience in a much larger universe and environment, right? If we were going to do, you know, one major gift officer to 100 people feels really good, but you know, you'd have to have a whole building of major gift officers to do a direct mail file of even 100,000 people. So understanding experience, activities, preferences, and being able to weave those into the stories and how you communicate with folks is really important. And that's what gives you that human sort of experience and touch. In direct mail, we're so used to RFM, right? But today, RFM doesn't tell the whole story. RFM is what they do to us, but we have to figure out what they do elsewhere.
That is brilliant and absolutely correct. Yes, I totally agree with you on all of that. That, you know, if all we're looking at is internal, we're missing, you know, it's like looking at the iceberg that hit the Titanic, right? We're seeing what we can see, but we're not seeing what's important that might sink us, right? So love that. And I'm going to tell my own kind of personal example around this. If some of you might have heard me speak before, and if you had, you may have heard this example, but I like to use CVS as the example of that one-to-one experience that you can do when you gather the right data. So on your full file, when you're doing things right, this is, to Richard's point, what he was talking about on the previous human experience screen. So I would go to CVS. I've been in, like I said, I've been in this space in data for over a decade, and about 10 years ago, CVS came out with their little CVS cards, and they would ask me every time I went, would you like a CVS card? And I said, no, I sell data for a living, and I know what you guys do with that data, and I don't want you to collect my data. And after several months, I went in, and I happened to like a salon quality shampoo, and the little placard underneath the shampoo said, hey, if you have a CVS card, we'll give you $5 off the shampoo. Well, I consider myself to be frugal. And so for $5, they could have all my data. But what they did that was brilliant. And one of the things we're going to kind of have as a theme as we talk through this is mapping out the journey as you go before you start to do this. And so they actually had mapped out a journey. If you Google this is actually on Google. This is they mapped out this journey to me, right? Basically to help me. And so what they were able to do is they said, okay, well, if we're going to gather data on people, we're going to talk to them about the things that are important to them. So when we send them an email, it's only going to be with coupons about things that they have already purchased or like things that they might be interested in. They were brilliant when it came to this. So now every morning I wake up, and I'm sure most everybody on this webinar has the same experience. I have a whole bunch of emails from places that I bought things from that are trying to get me to buy more that's on sale. I swipe on all of them. I delete them all because I could just go to their website. Like, I don't need to open up the email. CVS, I open up every single one of their emails because I want to see what coupons they have so I can download them to my card. So this experience is my personal journey, but I hope it kind of shares that big picture about why our donors' expectations are changing. We want to be that nonprofit that speaks to them in the language that they feel like it's a one-to-one communication, to Richard's point before. And the reality is that we're all nonprofits now are data companies. We're collecting massive amounts of data, whether you're doing external data appends or not. The great transfer of wealth is coming, and we want to help prepare you so that you're not scared for what that is. And Richard, you might want to talk a little bit around this as well, as far as, I think we kind of chatted about, what data are people collecting, and is it the right data, or are they collecting too much data, that kind of overwhelming sense of it?
So I wish we weren't on mute with the 200 participants, because we would hear a collective groan. One of the things that we know when we're working with our database administrators and our folks is that they like to keep their databases tight, and they like data governance. And one of the things when you think about data collection and this data deluge, it's sort of, you have to understand, what data are you going to collect, how are you going to keep it fresh, and what are you going to do with it, whether it be what's the measurement, what metrics, or what segmentation, or what journey are they going to be on. And so if you can't really answer those three questions, you probably need to think about, is this something that I want to work on? And the example that I'm going to give you all is, I once worked with an organization, and they were getting ready for a planned giving mailing. What's the most important thing you need for planned giving? Well, typically it's age, or age band, or birth date, something about how old am I, so we know where we are in the cycle. So I talked to the organization. I say, all right, tell me about your giving bands. And they said, here they are. It's field number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it's A through F. I said, this is great. When did you do this age overlay? You know what they said? We don't know. So everybody on this file was 50 years old for the past 10 years.
Oh my goodness.
Right? So that's what, so the story or the takeaway from here is, right? What data are you going to collect? How are you going to keep it up to date, fresh? That's important. And then what are you going to measure on it? So it makes it really easy.
Yeah. Great point. Great point. And Harmonie, I'm going to bring you in here because you have such an incredible story around when you joined Children's Health, and the whole idea around deciding to be a more data-driven organization, and why that is, and some of the stories that you guys focused on when you started to look at your data.
So first of all, I have to say, Richard, I loved the way you described peering behind major giving into the rest of the pipeline. I love to describe annual giving as the art of creating a personal relationship on a mass scale. And that's something that people have really grown accustomed to, right? To Dawn's point, CVS knows you. You have a relationship with CVS now. I feel that way about my Netflix account. My Netflix account and I know each other really, really well. And they only recommend things that I absolutely want to be adding to my queue. So this is something that really is happening in people's personal lives, and they've come to expect it. And really, our institutions need to meet them where they are. So I was hired 2 years ago to come and lead the annual giving team at Children's Health. At the time, it was not a team. There was a single woman who was doing a fantastic job trying to run several annual giving programs. And so I came on and joined her to really bring a focus to our programs. and really lead with data-driven informed decision-making around those programs. I was very fortunate because when I did come in, Children's Health had actually just contracted with Pursuant and had conducted a 360-degree review of our donor database. And they presented us with about 118 slides worth of data, so I can absolutely speak to the data overload. Where do you even begin? But really, they helped to bring a couple of things really to the forefront of that data to help us focus in on. The first thing was that our major gift donors who were on file, 68% of them had initially been annual giving donors. So the annual giving donor pipeline was very strong.
That just blows Harmony, like that to me is like pure gold, that one single data point, and you got many of them, but back to that point that it's like being able to nurture those people correctly. That's your future. That feeds every other aspect of your strategy, right? So that initial gift becomes an annual gift, becomes a monthly gift, becomes potentially a planned gift, because we know your best plan givers are your monthly donors, and that's feeding your major gift. And so you can't ignore any piece of it. And I hear from so many, they've got this team for major gifts, and we're not really doing anything else. And I just love the idea that if you kind of turn it on its head a little bit and think about, no, this is critical because it feeds all the other pieces.
Absolutely. But the flip side of that, Dawn, was that while our annual giving programs were doing a fantastic job of acquiring new donors, we were able to see that we were only retaining 19% of them. So imagine if we could take those donors and retain them and pull them into that pipeline in a better way by establishing better relationships with them. And so that was really what was highlighted for us, was that we were not doing a good job of creating those personal relationships on that mass scale. And so we started with that as our driving data point to guide our strategy moving forward. We really, really needed to make a shift in the way we thought about establishing relationships with our annual giving donors.
That's amazing. And I think when people start to think about data, and as the people that are on this call are starting to think, or maybe they are already using data, or they've got data and they don't know how to use it, one thing that came away from me on our conversations prior to, meeting prior to this, was that you guys focused specifically on kind of one outcome that you wanted to have, and focused on optimizing that one thing. And so one of the things, I think another takeaway from your experience in this is that if you can get and understand one thing that you want to do better, and then figure out a plan to do it better, that in and of itself is worth the data that you're looking at and stuff like that. But it's about focusing on the outcomes as much as it is about anything else.
Absolutely. So that became the primary focus for our entire foundation for the year. And we were actually able to move our donor retention by 6 percentage points in 1 year, just by taking that one data point and selecting it as the outcome that we were going to focus on.
I love that, Harmony. Did you have to focus on channel, or what kind of strategic shift did you do to get these folks more engaged?
It's such a great question, Richard. So a lot of it was really came down to two things. One was doing a better job of stewarding these donors, and then really speaking to who they were. We were not really doing any messaging segmentation prior to this focus. So nobody ever heard from us, we know who you are. And so now, using the data that we're able to get, we can create strategic messages. I just did one of my favorite ones. We utilize thank you a lot. We send out thank you videos. I know a lot of organizations do that, but you can really personalize those messages. So we've just sent them out for a peer-to-peer fundraising campaign. So we could say, Richard, thank you so much for giving to Dawn's peer-to-peer fundraising campaign. Dawn ended up raising $3,000 to make life better for children, and you helped her get there. you know, just pull in those little nuggets of data so that Richard now knows, oh, they see me. They know who I am. They know what I'm doing and the impact that I'm making.
Yeah, and
Cool.
Harmonie told me another story along the same lines, which was, you know, because you work with us, we can give you data points like who's interested in arts and who's interested in healthcare and who's interested in social services. And then you can actually tailor that first time donor's message where you can say, oh, these people are interested in art, so let's talk to them about our music therapy program that we have for the children, or let's talk to them about the stuff we do for people who might be underinsured or uninsured when it comes from a social services perspective, so that that person again is getting a thank you and telling the story about something that they're already interested in, correct?
Yes, and we do that a lot with our lapsed or soon to be lapsed donors. We can isolate them, and then by overlaying external data, we can see, okay, so we haven't been able to engage in this group, and I might not know from what's sitting in our donor database what their interests are. But by overlaying that external data, I can see, oh, for example, they support arts programs. So let's talk to them about our music therapy and our art therapy programs, because that's probably a really good way to draw them in and re-engage them with children's.
Love it, love it. That's amazing. So we're going to throw a poll up. Sorry, I threw this screen up before, but we're going to throw a poll up. We just want to engage our audience and just ask, you know, what are your, whoops, I don't know what just happened. Sorry about that. What are your are you leading with the data driven strategy? And so, you know, are you really data focused? You know, children's health, as we're hearing from Harmonie, is doing a great job with it. Are you kind of doing it, but you don't really, you might have data, but you don't know what to do with it. You don't even know where to start. Just give us an idea of where you're at with this, and then we'll throw the poll results up after. I'll give you guys 30 seconds or so to answer. I feel like I always need to like sing the Jeopardy song here. All right, Daryl, did you okay, I'm just going to go ahead and move forward.
Well, results should be up now, no?
Yes.
I can't see them.
A pretty good even split across. Well, Dawn, just so you know, 23% said yes, data is a priority and we're leveraging it to make decisions. 16% said yes, but it's way too much data and we don't quite know what to do with it. 22% said no, don't really know where to start. And 39%, which is our majority here, said that they've started but still have a long way to go.
Yeah. And that's pretty much what we see across when we do this poll. Is it's the fourth one is usually the majority, but they're fairly evenly split between. And so that's great. The people who are doing a great job, we'd love to hear your stories. And you know, obviously anybody who is not, we're hoping that you get some great information out of the rest of this webinar that we're doing. So we're going to move on to the second bullet point that we talked about, and that is data privacy concerns. And I will tell you, of all of the things I know about data privacy is not my top one. So I'm going to ask Richard to come in here and talk a little bit about data privacy, what you know about data privacy, what might be changing, concerns from your clients, those types of things.
Sure. So what's really interesting about data privacy is we talk about it a lot, and that's what we talk about. And so, you know, when you sort of get down to sort of that next level, right? People have an understanding that, you know, data privacy is managed through data security, but how do we actually understand and figure out how to comply with these rules, right? And that's where everybody sort of takes their own sort of look and feel. And it almost is parallel back to the days when, you know, HIPAA came out, and if there was something that you didn't want to do, you said, HIPAA says we can't do it. And people would say, okay, because they didn't have any understanding on how to comply with what the HIPAA rules were. So interestingly enough, Gartner did a study a few years back where they say that, you know, data privacy is really one of the most important things that your constituents, your supporters are engaged in. And they actually equate data privacy and the idea and the emotional sort of surrounding of it to back in the day when we sort of introduced the term, you know, organic or organic chicken or cruelty-free eggs or those things. It's sort of, you know, it evokes sort of a feeling. And, you know, today what our clients are saying to us is right, how do we create a transparent environment where we have the folks where we can say, this is how we know what we know about you. This is the data that we're collecting about you. Can we collect data about you? Can we trade data about you, or any of these pieces? And that goes back to Dawn's, you know, question of, right, is $5 enough for her to get her hair done? You know, not sure, but this is where everybody starts to begin to think about things like, are my digital acquisition Facebook polls working really well? Are my survey questions being answered? How do I understand the conversational components to zero-party data or that origination data, and how does that relate to first-party data, right? And then as we go through, we all know what's happening with Apple and having to be able to opt in, and Google taking the Chrome and the cookies, right? So the question, you know, in terms of data privacy is, right, you know, the headline is, it's really important. Your organization needs to make best understandings on how you're going to engage in data privacy. And then the third part is, right, how are you going to be transparent and actually communicating that to your donors and your supporters so that they have trust in how they engage with you.
That's great. Yeah, Richard, thank you. Very, very thoughtful information. And then Harmonie, from your experience, from a fundraising perspective, how do you deal with the privacy challenges around some of the stuff that you're doing?
Yeah, I have a love-hate relationship with data privacy. I think, you know, we all personally have the same feeling that you do, Dawn. You know, nobody wants their data sold to anybody else. We don't want the extra emails and the extra spam and everything. And so I think we all understand it from that perspective. As a digital marketer, though, the fact that I can no longer figure out if people who are viewing my emails on their iPhone are opening them or not really drives me bananas. That's kind of messed with us a little bit, because open rates were one of the primary ways that we were measuring the efficacy of our emails. So it cuts both ways. In the healthcare industry specifically, we have to be really careful about HIPAA laws. To Richard's point, and there's a lot of nuance in there with what cannot be shared with third parties, and we lean towards very conservative with what we share out because of that. I suppose it was about 1.5 years ago now, there was a massive breach with a company that a lot of us use for our constituent databases in this industry and other industries, other nonprofit industries as well. A lot of hospitals got dinged really hard by that because they had patient and patient family data in that constituent database. Children's Health, we keep it all on internal servers behind a firewall. So none of our grateful patient family was in the constituent database to be lost to that breach. But it's something that we have to be very, very careful of in our industry. And having worked in higher education for a number of years as well, FERPA is another reality that people have to be very cognizant of as well. And so really being thoughtful and considerate about your constituents' data is incredibly important. Even though when I have my marketer hat on, I find it frustrating.
I agree with you. I drive so much of my strategy, my outreach strategy, based on old open rates and click-through rates, and I've had to completely change my personal strategy on it when it comes to outreach, because and do different things to be able to understand what's working and what's not working. And one other thing I'll add around data privacy, and it's really not data privacy as much as that when somebody gives you additional data points, when they tell you things, whether you ask us through a survey or they just share information with you, that data that they personally share with you is very, very important and needs to be shared across the organization as a whole, and you need to do the thing that they said. And the example that I like to give is, you know, my mom's 81 years old and she does not like to be called by her first name. It sounds really unusual to her because she grew up with, you know, all of us calling their parents Mr. and Mrs. And so that's kind of the way she wants to be, especially if she doesn't know somebody. And so if you're calling from a nonprofit and you pick up the phone and you call her by her first name and she doesn't know you, she's going to feel very offended by that. But she tells people that, and she says, hey, that I don't like to be called by my first name. That feels very uncomfortable for me. Would you please address me as Mrs., right? And so she's freely given that data to the organization. That organization now needs to take that data and steward it well, right? Where they make sure that, hey, if you ask, how would you like to be, what salutation would you like? Make sure that you and everyone in your organization are doing that, because when somebody gives you their data willingly, the reason why they're giving that to you is so that you can build a better relationship with them. So you better make sure that you steward that data really well. Awesome. Okay, so moving on to what we all near and dear to all of us is, okay, taking command of data. So we all know, and we're talking about the fact that we need data, but we need the right data. So what does that mean? What does that mean? And so we, Richard and Harmonie, were discussing this prior to getting ready for the webinar, and we all came to the same kind of agreement that really, it used to be that people would gather a bunch of data, whether it was their internal data, whether it was their gift data, whether it was their constituent data. They might enhance it with, you know, a wealth screening and get a bunch of other data, maybe an age append and all this other stuff. And then they're like, what are we going to do now? And then it was death by massive data. And Richard talks about this as well. Like, I have literally had clients that I have done huge screenings for, that I've circled back around a year later and said, hey, how did that screening go that you did with us? And they never used the data because it was overwhelming to them. So when we're talking about data, what we all agree the best approach to data is to focus on what you want the outcome of something to be, and then determine what data you need to produce that outcome, right? So instead of having death by a bunch of data, and you can still get that data and maybe use it someplace, but at least you'll know what data you need in particular for what it is, the outcomes. The one that Richard, and I'm sure, Richard, you have a bunch of stories like this, but the one that I remember that you and I talked about was, you had a client or had been speaking to somebody, or just maybe had heard this story that somebody wanted to do a text outreach to their file, and when the file was looked at, only 5% or 10% of the constituents in their file, they had cell phone numbers on. So they might have gone through this whole campaign to do this text outreach to then find out that they didn't have the data points that they needed to actually produce a good outcome. And so, Richard, I know you have stories like that, but I'd love for you to chat a little bit about your idea of data and the outcome-focused reasons why we need to focus on what data is important.
Yeah, no, I think that's really, I think that's a good segue, only in the sense that, you know, in the space today, we've got lots of folks on our file. We know very little bit, a very small part about what they do to us, but we need to sort of understand what's happening in the external space. And so when we think about what kind of activities folks are working on and what they're doing, is they've got whole other lives. So you know, something that we do at Data Axle is we look at donor behaviors, but we match them to consumer behaviors. So for example, I may have a client that only responds to direct mail, but in their consumer life, they've actually have a Blue Apron subscription. They've given their credit card in. And what does a Blue Apron subscription or Netflix really sound like in the fundraising space, Harmonie? A very good sustainer, right? A very good reoccurring giver. So, you know, it's really hard to, you know, it's really sort of figure out if we want to, you know, maximize our sustainer program, what are sustainer behaviors that we need to look for from data points, channel perspective, credit card or check perspective, age, you know, all those different pieces, and then sort of reverse engineer what are those ingredients that are going to get us to those pieces.
Yeah, I love that. And, you know, even looking at internal data. So is that donor, is their number of gifts each year increasing, right? So even if all you have is internal data points, you can still take command of that data by looking at things like, has somebody been a monthly giver year over year for the last 5 years and they're 55 years old? You need to start talking to them about planned giving because they love you. They've identified that they love you. They've re-upped the same credit card 5 times to continue to give to you. That is a great person to be a good plan giver. So it's the internal data and the external data in combination that I think is really where the power of data actually exists. So some of the data that we talk about are, we wanted to kind of chat through what are some different types of data that you might have that you kind of need and that will optimize your data-driven strategy. And so, you know, obviously the bare necessity is to have as clean a file as you possibly can, to be able to dedupe that file so that you're making sure that you are thanking people appropriately. You know, make sure that you have, whether you're doing householding correctly or not. I hear stories about people who the wife writes the check to the organization and might write a big check to the organization and sign, but the husband goes to the golf event. They never identify that the husband is a major donor because it was in the wife's name. And so he goes to this golf event and doesn't get the recognition he thinks he should get as being a major donor, and they lose that donor. So these are things that are just really bare necessities. And then the must and goods, Richard, you and I kind of chatted through this. In the world today, when we're talking about, are you going to be behind in data or are you going to be a superstar in data? These start to be table stakes, to be honest with you. However, the more we get on this, the better off you are and the better in place. So that 25% that was said, hey, we're doing great with our data, they probably, I would be willing to bet, have this type of data. But Richard, is there specific data points that you find are critical to have versus that are in this must-have or good to have?
What I think is really interesting is, right, in any organization, you sort of have to figure out what your minimal viable record is, and it really differs by vertical. So Harmonie's been in a few verticals, right? And the thing I love about higher ed is they have to collect all this data. They know all this stuff about you because you spend 4 years spending a lot of money there, or maybe 5 years. But in most organizations, when you think about the must-haves and the good-to-haves, right, there are some really basic sort of segmentation components when you think about, all right, how do I take RFM and really put another, you know, a third parallel on that to look at RFM by channel, and how does that relate to communication preference? And then how do you actually take that kind of data and look at the bands and look at the giving and the engagement, you know, based upon gender and age, which are really just, you know, just some of the basics. But then when you move over to sort of the good side of the house, right, wealth is really important, giving preferences are important, but the other thing, and Dawn and Harmonie, I'm sure, can tell stories about this as well, nobody is going to sell their house to give you an annual fund gift. So understand, real estate holdings are really interesting, but I've been on a lot of major gifting appointments where I go into a $10 million house with IKEA furniture, so that there's not a lot of liquidity there. So you've got to think about what kind of data you're going to keep and then how you're going to keep it on there. But to Dawn's point, you know, start with a few and then start using those as measurements and see what the trends are that come out, and then see how to enhance them.
I love that. And then to me, again, and I said this before, that, you know, the optimal is the combination of the internal and the external data. And can you combine that in a way easily within whatever the tools are that you're using to come out with actionable results, right? So again, kind of to that point about data overload, you could have all of this data, but if you can't combine that data and say, oh, well, my internal information says this person's been a monthly giver for, you know, X amount of years, but you don't know their age, or you don't know what their giving preference is, or something like that, then you might not be able to have the right kind of conversations that really speak to that donor in a way that's going to encourage them to give. So it's the combination that I believe is really where the goodness is in data. And so, Harmonie, just to bring you back in on this piece is, you know, from an organizational perspective, when you guys started talking about data, I'd love to know kind of what the processes were that you might have had to go through. I know you've grown your annual team, you know, considerably since then, but, you know, anything that you can help the listeners here today learn about, you know, from, I think there's one thing is great to say, we want data, but then there's another thing to say, is the organization ready for data, and what do we need to do to change to make it ready? And I'd love to hear some from you around that.
Absolutely. So I've given a couple of examples already in terms of what we've done with ThinkView, stewardship, segmentation, really personalizing our communication. We've also done quite a bit with OmniChannel communication, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, but really focusing on, you know, retargeting people on social media who've maybe opened an email but haven't responded to it, and things of that nature, so that we can really continue to build those relationships with people. One of the other things that I think is really great, Richard talked about reverse engineering. We work very, very closely with our prospect management colleagues, so we can look to identify, you know, who is, you know, take a look at your mid-level donors, really building out that middle of the pyramid. It is such an important group of donors that we maybe don't talk about enough. And what did their giving histories look like? What were their engagements with us previously? What external data do we have on them? And then how do you reverse engineer it to identify those people who are in that mass marketing point right now, the people who are having that one-to-many conversation, who are ready to move up and maybe be put in an annual giving officer's portfolio for more of that high touch. That's another area where we really harness data. And in terms of internal processes, I think one of the biggest shifts that we had to make on the annual giving team was to really think about what it means to use data to inform our decision making. So for every team meeting that we have a set of slides that we will go through, and we'll say, okay, here's where we're at with donor retention and how that compares to the last 2 years, year to date. Are we tracking with where we want to be? Are we behind? What does that mean if we're behind? What adjustments can we be making so that we're not just looking at these things once a year? We're really in every single meeting taking a look at the data points for our goals and our outcomes for that particular year, and looking at it and thinking strategically about how we can make adjustments throughout the year if we're not tracking where we want to be.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And the other thing I think is it used to be that, and I think Children's Health does a really good job with this. It used to be that teams were siloed, so we would have our team that, you know, your major gifts team was siloed from your annual team, was siloed from your communications team. And really, when you start using data in the way that Children's Health is using it so effectively, you break down those silos. You have to. You can't have one person own one thing and one person own the other thing. You need to really be a silo breaker to do that, I would think. So real quick, I love this screen, and I'm going to tell everybody, if there's no other screen that you screenshot, this would be one. It's also going to be in any follow-up that we send out to you. But now that we've talked about data, one of the things that I find is that people talk about it, but then they don't really plan for a successful execution of it. And so what we'd like to do is just give you the steps to activate data at scale. And so this is just, for me, I'm all about creating a way to be successful that I can manage and duplicate. And so this is kind of no matter which outcome you're trying to get results on, if you identify the desired outcome first, and then what you need to do is you need to think, what data do I need to create the outcome that I have? If I'm going to do a text campaign, I need to make sure I have cell phone numbers, right? So thinking through the data that you have or the data that you need to create a successful outcome, capture the internal data that you need or the external data that you need and integrate it all together. And then build your action plan. What are your next steps? What are your next actions, the moves you're going to take for a successful outcome? And then, of course, execute, test, and optimize, right? And so Harmonie's going to tell an interesting story here in a couple of minutes around something that they did that was not super successful, but then they had to go back and test and figure out why that was. So, execute, and if it's not successful, you need to be testing why wasn't it successful? What did we do that was wrong? And her story is going to align to that really well. Before we do that, we're getting a little short on time, so I just want to make sure that we walk through this. We wanted to talk about multi-channel and omni-channel, and when Harmonie and Richard and I all talked about it, we were all like, we're not 100, like, we kind of know what multi-channel. Richard has a really good idea of his definition of what multi-channel and omni-channel are. We all kind of know, and all of you know that multi-channel donors that are engaging with us in multiple different ways and maybe giving in multiple different ways, they have a higher life to date of giving, but what does that actually mean? How do we accomplish that? So I'm going to bring Richard and Harmonie in now to kind of chat through multi-channel, omni-channel. What does it mean? What they're doing? What's working? That type of thing.
So what's really interesting, right? We sort of use multi-channel and omni-channel as interchangeable in the space. And if anytime you pick up the Nonprofit Times or read any blogs, people are like, multi-channel is dead, omni-channel is the new thing. But some of us haven't even gotten to, two channels yet. So when we think about multi-channel as a definition, we think about what are the channels on how we engage with folks in the fundraising space. Do we send them mail? Do we call them? Do they engage in peer-to-peer? Do they do email? Do we have search engine optimization? Like, what are the things that we do? And it's really about taking a channel and putting a strategy behind that channel to optimize it, right? Omni-channel is sort of the next iteration of that. And instead of looking at the channel first, we actually look at our audiences first, right? And we engage in audiences and we put tactics in place where we try to figure out how do we actually follow them from channel to channel to channel, so that the messaging that they're going to get is on brand, based on the journey that they're on, and the outcome the organization wants to go to. And what I would say is, a lot of organizations have already taken the multi-channel to omni-channel step. It's really, in the space today, it's easy to talk about. I shouldn't say it's easy, because nothing's easy. But it's easier to actually take a direct mail list, figure out what their email addresses are, and send out a piece of mail and email them at the same time to reinforce the message. But once you get to this idea of, okay, am I going to understand and show them the message on Facebook? And when they get to my website and they don't follow through, am I going to send them a different email message, or am I going to retarget them? That's where things get a little bit more complicated. So I wouldn't say hard, but they get to be more complicated and more steps. And I think Harmonie, at your organization, you're sort of taking them through that journey.
Yeah, we certainly try to. It's maybe just a little bit more sophisticated than sending a message out on all these different channels, but really thinking a little bit more thoughtfully and strategically about who is seeing what and where and when.
Yeah, and I think about it just in my space in the real world of everything else. There are certain, again, there are certain places where I'll go and I'll put something in a cart, my shopping cart, and the ones that do it really well, I'll get an email that says, hey, this is about to sell out. You know what I mean? And so it's kind of that idea of, but you have to have the bandwidth to be able to do it, right? And so when we talk about multi-channel or omni-channel, don't like jump to omni-channel if you are barely doing multi-channel, right? Like, to me, that's kind of a takeaway on that. Do 2 channels well, to Richard's point, before you start trying to do all of these other things and doing them not as well as
water before wine.
Exactly. And understanding what's the most important channel to those individuals as well. So again, to Richard's point, if you're sending out a direct mail piece, figure out or get a data company to help you understand who's the most responsive digitally, who's the most responsive by picking up the phone. We have Harmonie's going to tell a really cool story on this next slide, but understanding where those people's channels are increases their attention and their attention, their retention and engagement. And Harmonie, I'm going to ask you just to kind of tie this in a bow and tell me that story you told me yesterday, which is so interesting, around understanding channel preferences and when you don't do it right.
Yeah. Our parents always told us that we learn from our mistakes, right? So this was probably one of the best or biggest learning moments that I have had around data. So I was working at an incredible university about 5 years ago, and a gentleman was on my team. He was a young alum of the university. He was very eager to start a new campaign. And he said, look, everything that we are reading about millennials and young alumni now is that they want to give to causes. We have to approach this with cause marketing. And they give online. It's digital. The world is digital. So I want to create an online, all digital cause marketing campaign for the university. I said, man, that sounds brilliant. I mean, that checks all the boxes of everything that we are hearing about millennials and young alumni right now. So we tried it, and I'm going to tell you, it was beautiful. I mean, our marketing colleagues went above and beyond, gorgeous. Literally, I cannot make this up, brought in 0 gifts, not a single one. And that just left me kind of scratching my head. I mean, how could we have had such a big flop? So I went in and I started going into our data, and our data analysis was not very sophisticated. I literally asked for a report of every single transaction that had been made by somebody in a certain 10-year class range. And I went through and I did the analysis in Excel on my own, creating little pie charts. It doesn't have to be fancy. You can learn a lot just from those Excel spreadsheets. And what we learned was that while, yes, those were the trends, they were not true for our constituents. Our young alumni responded, the #1 channel that they gave through was phone, and the second one was direct mail. And in all honesty, I think it's because it cuts through the clutter. As Dawn said earlier, you can swipe those emails right out of your inbox quicker than you can say, I don't want your email anymore. And it's a little bit harder. There's novelty in phone calls. There's novelty in receiving a piece of mail in your mailbox now. So it was a really, really great lesson for us to learn.
That's great. And I think that it also kind of circles back around to, while we're talking about data and we're talking about the data that you may need to get from external sources, the bottom line is you can't only rely on external sources. You have to look at your internal data to help you with those decisions too, and that trends aren't always going to work, and you need to look at that internal data. So thanks, Harmonie. I love that story. So just to wrap it up, we want to leave you with a little bit of an action plan and summarize. And that is that the human experience wins. All of us want to have a human experience, and data is the way that helps us understand and communicate to our donors and and anybody that's in our database at a much more human level. Leveraging donor data is no longer an option. It's just table stakes. We just have to do it. You need to make an outcome plan and start slow. water to wine, I think is what Richard said. I always say walk, jog, run, right? You don't want to go out if you've never run and run a marathon, but you could walk a 5K maybe, right? So make sure that as you're moving forward that you have a plan and that you're able to actually execute on that plan. And then multi-channel is a must, but you need to figure out how you manage it and what you do. So we've got about 5 minutes left, and I want to open it up for Q&A. So John, I don't know whether you've received any questions, but we'd love to answer anything that you've got.
Yes, we have some really great questions. And the first one is directed to you, Richard, about the impact of the pandemic on giving. People want to know, or at least our listeners want to know, if the strategies they've used to deal with the pandemic will remain in place or will revert back to pre-pandemic giving patterns.
So, that's a great question. And the answer is we don't know yet. Our early analysis of those COVID donors look very much like emergency donors, and folks are trying very hard to figure out how to convert them into a regular kind of program or journey. So that's sort of one component that makes this complicated. Component number two, which is making it really complicated, is people can't buy paper or labels or envelopes or print. And because the supplies aren't out there, the things that people are used to doing for testing and for engaging, they have to pull back on different programs, and budgets are way in flux, right? And then, associated with that problem is I'm hearing a lot of horror stories about cagers just not being able to keep up with volumes. So our results are really delayed. So we have that challenge. And then the third piece to this stool is consumer confidence it's a real thing, right? And some of the fundraisers that we're working with are seeing, they're having flashbacks to 2007, 2008. And yes. So with the way inflation is, everybody is really looking at everything. So I don't know that it's going to go back, but I think we're going to have new normal ×3, new normal ×4, in whatever those iterations are. But great question.
Thank you. The other one deals with your discussion on privacy. And several listeners want to know what GDPR's impact has been on data collection. And secondly, would an organization benefit by promoting their privacy policy to donors to encourage them to give more?
All right. I think I'm going to go second first, and then and see how we do. I think it'd be interesting to promote your privacy policy, but I also think it's interesting to not awaken a sleeping dog. Sometimes you don't want to promote a question or answer a question that's not being asked. And that's probably one of those that you want to be ready to have an answer and you want to be ready to engage in, but you'd really want to test how you would do that work. And I don't know, Harmonie, you're actually doing the fundraising today. So what do you think about that?
I agree with you completely, Richard. I'm just thinking through, anytime we sign up for a new subscription plan, how many of you actually read the terms and conditions before you do it? I mean, you scroll to the bottom as quickly as you can so that accept button will light up and you can finally click on it, right? If you're at the point where you're looking to make the gift, you don't want to be asking that donor to start reflecting on privacy concerns and data. I agree. I think there is absolutely concern out there. I think it's outweighed by the number of people who are just accustomed to, I look at my children, I have preteen children, they don't know what it means not to have their data, they have a Netflix account, it's locked down for kids, but that's their world. This is a world that people are growing ever accustomed to.
Great, thank you. This question is directed to you, Harmonie, is what did Children's Health use for external data overlays?
Oh, that is a great question. So we are a GivingDNA customer, and GivingDNA utilizes market data from Axiom. And so then they are able to match up the constituents in our database with that marketing data from Axiom and overlay it for us in a really, really easy to use platform.
Several of our listeners said they loved the video idea. Can you share more about how you made those videos?
Oh, I would love to. So I have been utilizing ThinkView for, I would say, probably 6 years now. It's an incredibly robust and valuable tool. You can do a lot with it. So you can use highly produced videos. We have utilized it for showing hospital tours to donors who maybe can't get to the hospital, you know, a virtual tour we can send out, beautifully, highly produced. You can do a quick cell phone video. We had a great a patient that we featured one year for a campaign. His mom just did a little cell phone video of him saying thank you while he was eating popcorn and roaring like a dinosaur. And it was so authentic and genuine and perfect. We do for a giving day, this is my absolute favorite, and it takes a small army. But we will record personal thank yous. So I have a team of staff who on that giving day, within an hour of a gift coming in, they're recording a personal thank you video that is, you know, so we're recording a new video every minute and sending it back out to donors. In the higher education space, we started using our student callers to record those personal videos for donors as well. So they really run the gamut. You can personalize the video, you can personalize just certain fields. So you can pull in a name field, the size of their last donation, the designation that they gave it to, and write just a beautiful thank you message that pulls all of those token fields into it. So it's very, very versatile.
And I'll just add to that, incorporating video into email is the new way to get people to engage in your emails or any other content that you have. So I love that whole idea, but video is really important for engagement also.
This last question is an interesting one. Have any of you had any experience with these cash transfer mechanisms like Venmo, Cash App, Zelle to accept donations?
I have in multiple spaces. It is incredibly, incredibly user-friendly. So it is wonderful for the donor to be able to Venmo you or PayPal you, especially if you do a lot of event fundraising, having the QR code right there that they can just immediately grab your Venmo account and give it to you, awesome. On the back end, you do not get a lot of donor information. So that can be the tricky part in terms of trying to steward those donors or bring them on a donor journey or not end up with duplicate records. If somebody is giving you a Venmo account that has an email attached to it that's not the same email that you have on file for them, you know, you're going to end up creating duplicate data. Yeah. So it's really fantastic for the end users, and it will boost your ability to accept donations, but it can be a little tricky on the back end, so you just have to be prepared for that.
So I think two things from my perspective, quick. Number one is tell the finance people of the world, don't be afraid of Venmo. It's not like, you know, trying to reconcile Visa, American Express, and Diners Card. So don't let your finance team be scared. The second thing I would say is, to Harmonie's point, that's where you use data to make sure that you're matching the right donations to the right pieces. So if you have multiple email addresses for folks, that's where you do appends and reverse appends to match names with people. Because typically, like a data axle, our average constituent has between 10, 15, 25 email addresses.
Great. I want to thank Pursuant for sponsoring today's session. And a special shout out to Dawn, Richard, and Harmonie for contributing their expertise to a really idea-packed webinar. So thank you, and thank you to the audience for attending. You may hang up your headsets.
Thank
you.
Right.
Thanks, Dawn. Thanks, Harmonie.
Thank you all.